Rocket Lab agreed to pay $8 billion for a satellite network no rival can rebuild. The spectrum took decades to lock up, and Rocket Lab was founded in New Zealand, but the governance sits in the United States, with no board seat and no veto for the country whose defense force depends on it. Which of your critical links now sit inside someone else's company?
Let's get into it.
In 1999, Iridium's satellite phone network collapsed into bankruptcy 9 months after launch, rescued only when a consortium backed by the United States Department of Defense stepped in. This is the Hamberger Report. I'm Andreas Hamberger, author of Space Mafia Wellington. 27 years later, a different company is buying that same network outright and paying $8 billion United States dollars to do it. On the 29th of June this year, Rocket Lab Corporation, founded in New Zealand in 2006 by Sir Peter Beck, a self-taught engineer from Invercargill and now listed on the Nasdaq exchange, announced a definitive agreement to acquire Iridium Communications. Rocket Lab builds and launches rockets. Iridium operates the only satellite network that guarantees connectivity at every latitude on Earth, pole to pole, and it holds a slice of internationally coordinated radio spectrum that took decades to negotiate. No new entrant can file for equivalent spectrum again. The coordination windows are effectively closed. A company that already controls a launch site, 2 rockets, and its own satellite factory is buying a global constellation, a defense communications contract, an aviation surveillance network, and a spectrum position that money alone cannot reproduce. The terms are precise. Rocket Lab will pay $54 per Iridium share, half in cash and half in Rocket Lab stock, with the stock portion set by a formula tied to average price over time. Both boards approved the deal unanimously. To fund the cash half, 2 banking partners committed a bridge loan of $3.6 billion United States dollars, most of which covers Iridium's existing debt. Rocket Lab intends to replace that bridge with permanent debt and equity before completion. Closing is targeted for the middle of 2027, subject to shareholder approval and to antitrust, communications, and national security clearances. The deal does not stand alone. Within the same 90-day window, Amazon agreed to acquire Globalstar for roughly $11.57 billion United States dollars. SES completed its purchase of Intelsat, and SpaceX agreed to take on EchoStar spectrum assets for large consolidations in 1 quarter. The satellite communications market that entered 2026 as a field of many independent operators is leaving the quarter concentrated around 3 vertically integrated giants, SpaceX, Amazon, and now Rocket Lab. Iridium reported around $871 million United States dollars in revenue for 2025 and runs at a profit. Rocket Lab reported around $520 million over the same period and has been spending heavily to build its next rocket. Space Mafia draws a line between 2 structures. The first is the vertical integration singularity. One company controlling everything from silicon to satellite, the model SpaceX built. The second is collaborative vertical integration. An allied nation entity spanning launch, manufacture, and orbital operations as a deliberate counterweight to single-actor control. Rocket Lab and Iridium executives have framed this acquisition in exactly those terms, as an answer to Starlink. Read the numbers and the framing looks strange. Starlink operates roughly 12,390 satellites with about 10 million subscribers. Iridium operates 66 active satellites and around 2.5 million subscribers. On raw scale, this is not a contest, but the combined company is not chasing broadband market share. It is buying market positions that scale cannot buy. Put launch, manufacture, operation, spectrum, defense communications, maritime safety, aviation surveillance, and an alternative to GPS into one company. And you approach what Space Mafia calls corporate Kardashev, a private entity controlling infrastructure at a scale that outruns any single regulator's reach. This Friday, episode 8 of Lethal by Design goes live on this channel, and it opens the book's chapter on autonomous targeting. If corporate Kardashev is the infrastructure question, Friday's episode is the weapons question that sits on top of it. There is history worth remembering here. The first Iridium constellation launched in 1998 and filed for bankruptcy 9 months later, in 1999, undone by the economics of satellite phones in a world busy building cellular towers. A consortium that included the United States Department of Defense rescued the network and returned it to commercial service in 2001. The current constellation, Iridium NEXT, was completed in 2019 with 66 active satellites and 14 in-orbit spares. So the question of who ultimately stands behind this network when the commercial logic wavers is not hypothetical. It has been answered once already, and the answer was a defense ministry. Consider what Iridium actually holds beyond the history. Its 66 cross-linked satellites sit in low Earth orbit at about 781 kilometers, arranged so they form a connected web that covers the poles and the deep valleys at high latitudes where other systems drop out. It holds internationally coordinated L-band spectrum, a band that penetrates cloud, forest canopy, and bad weather, and which is the default for emergency aviation and navigation augmentation signals. That spectrum was coordinated slowly and formally over decades. It is precisely the asset a grab-it-first playbook cannot deliver. It was settled before anyone tried. Here is the governance question underneath the numbers. Who governs the combined company? A United States national security review clears the transaction. United States corporate law, specifically Delaware law, governs the entity. United States defense contracts govern a substantial share of its revenue. The satellite communications, New Zealand's defense and emergency users rely on reach them through United States Department of Defense contracts, the EMSS framework, the satellite service agreement held by Iridium and sustained with the United States Space Force. After this acquisition, that framework sits inside a company reviewed and cleared through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and governed under Delaware law. New Zealand hosts the launch site at Mahia under our own ground-based space infrastructure regime, but holds no equity, no board seat, and no veto over the combined entity. Allied national security users hold the constellation as customers of that contract, not as co-owners or co-governors of it. That is not a criticism of the structure. It is a description of it, and it is exactly the question New Zealand organizations running maritime aviation or emergency communications now need to map for themselves. So the allied nation vertical integration turns out to mean the launch geography sits in New Zealand and the founder is a New Zealand citizen. The governance authority sits entirely within the United States legal, financial, and national security framework. That is the sovereignty question. This deal reopens, and it is not really about whether the infrastructure exists. It plainly does, and it is very good. The question is whether, depending on a well-run, allied-founded, United States-governed company counts as sovereignty or as a more comfortable form of dependence. Owning is a governance right. Hosting is a lease. There is a fifth dependency, easy to miss because it stays invisible until it fails. New Zealand's electricity grid timing, financial transaction timestamps, telecommunications synchronization, and much of its aviation and maritime positioning all lean on the Global Positioning System, a United States defense system. Iridium's positioning chip is the rare commercial alternative, a signal it describes as usable, where GPS is jammed or spoofed. After this deal, that alternative is owned by a United States-listed company under United States defense contracts. Long commercial path away from GPS dependence runs through the same jurisdiction GPS already does. Two things are worth watching. The first is Space Connect, the trade association 4 satellite operators formed to give themselves a regulatory voice, only to see 2 of its 4 founders enter acquisition talks within days of forming it. The second is Launch Independence. Rocket Lab's Neutron, a reusable medium-lift rocket capable of carrying roughly 13,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit, is targeted for a first flight late this year, and Rocket Lab's own materials point to Neutron as the vehicle that would eventually replenish the Iridium constellation. If that holds, the combined company would launch, build, and operate its own network without depending on a competitor's rocket. That remains a forward commitment rather than a completed flight, so treat the timeline as a target, not a fact. The $8 billion bought a spectrum position, a defense contract, and a global network, it did not buy any allied nation a seat at the table where those assets are governed. If you run maritime, aviation, or emergency communications anywhere in New Zealand, have you mapped which of your links now terminate inside a single vertically integrated company, and what your fallback is if the terms ever change?
That is the Hamburger Report for today. If this was useful, subscribe and hit the like button. It helps more professionals find the channel. You will find links to everything we covered in the description below. I am Andreas Hamberger, and I will see you tomorrow.
Like and subscribe.